Greetings and welcome to my channel, everybody, and first video. My name is Sebastian and I'm a software engineer. I thought that I would start out with a small series about some of the steps I've taken in my career and some lessons I've learned along the way. And I wanted to make today's video about how I graduated from university and then started with my first job as a software developer. I graduated university in 2010 and immediately started working for my first company. And I wanted to talk about some differences which immediately occurred to me when starting to work out for this company. The first major difference which I noticed is that it's pretty different when you're working inside a large team, which does not only consist of developers, but also product managers, testers, designers, and so on. Instead of working on the projects you would work on mostly on your own during university. There's a big difference there. The second difference I wanted to talk about is that it's much different when working on a corporate level because the projects are usually larger with thousands, 10,000s, maybe even 1,000,000 lines of code and so far. Whereas the projects you would be making in university would usually be on a smaller scale so that they could be created by your professors or the teaching assistants and such. And the third difference, which I wanted to talk about, is that you have active customers when you're working for a company, which you don't have when you're in university. So those are the three main differences when starting out in the corporate world instead of university, which I wanted to focus on. Now, when you're working within a team for the first time in your career, there are going to be some clashes along with your colleagues because there are different opinions on code style, on how to solve problems and other things like that, and you will have to work out compromises or maybe in the beginning just learn from your colleagues how they are tackling problems which you are occurring on a day-to-day basis and how you can basically grow with your team and how you can take on larger obstacles together. However, there may also be some opinions or design decisions which you really don't agree on. And as an example from my personal experience, this first company I was working with, they developed a web software and they didn't want the customer to see any errors whatsoever. So the customer would perform an action, something went wrong in the background on the server, or it doesn't really matter, but they wouldn't see any kind of error message. They would then start to inspect if their action was successful or they would be missing some data or things like that. And so the support calls naturally came pouring in. Something went wrong, nobody knew what, there was no error message. And quite frankly, this decision to just never to display any error message produced more problems than it actually solved, because naturally the error still occurred, the customers just didn't see it and couldn't report anything. So we kind of had to figure out what actually went wrong without having any information from our customers, which was kind of bad. So this was something which happened to me on the first job and which I really wasn't okay with, but it was a design decision made by the product manager to never show anything, and so I just had to deal with it. When you start working with such a large project for the first time, it may be easy for you to get lost within the code base because you don't know the patterns which are being used. You may not even be that familiar with the language being used in this project. So you may not feel that productive because it's pretty hard for you to get stuff done already, to maybe solve some bugs where you don't know which might be causing this. You may have a hard time implementing new features because you don't know how you can write stuff into the database the fastest and things like that. However, when starting out with a new company or being transferred to a new project, you will always have this problem. You will always need to dig through the new code base of this project you're being assigned to and try to figure out which part of the system is doing what, and it will take some time for you to be productive again with this different system. However, one thing which I encountered which was really problematic was with a system which was so-called historically grown, which just means features were being added along the way, and the technical debt, which was pretty small in the beginning, started to mount up. And so if you started touching some of the older parts of the system, it started breaking in different parts, which led to the decision that some parts of the system were only to be touched by the most senior developers. So if a junior developer who just started out with this project found a bug and wanted to fix it, and he or she would have to touch exactly those classes, the pull request or the code change was just denied because it wasn't done by those senior guys. And this is really really problematic within a team, because it kind of leads to this I'm senior and you are junior kind of thinking, which I don't really think is that appropriate. Now, as for having active customers within the project or for your software, there are some different problems which you can encounter. The first being that maybe you are going to have to do support calls with your customer and you aren't experienced on how to talk with customers yet, and you will need to get used to this. But there will also be problems that you may not be able to do every change to the system which you want, because some of the features may be used by only one customer. So you really don't want to have such a feature within your software because it's buggy or really not that well maintained. But this one customer depends on it, so you can't really get rid of it. A different problem is when you want to make changes to a system which is already being used by the customer. Maybe you have a application running within the cloud and you want to make some changes to the web application. And those changes are mainly within the UI. Some customers may complain about this because all of a sudden the UI looks different and they don't appreciate that. But there are also other things which you need to take into consideration. When your company sells any kind of app for iOS or Android, chances are pretty high that this app needs to communicate with some kind of server. And this server communicates via an API normally. So if you want to make any kind of change to this API, you need to take into consideration if those changes will somehow break the communication with potential devices out there still using the old version of this API. So you can't make any changes you want, even if there are some outdated calls in there which you may want to get rid of, but you can't do it and kind of need to plan on how to roll those changes out gradually so that you change the apps first, remove any calls to this API which you want to get rid of, and then you can deploy changes to the API. This is nothing which you need to consider when you're working on a university project and working on stuff for your own, because you are your only client, you're using this, you may be showing this to your professor, but you don't need to take any compatibility issues within consideration, and you can just start working on it, break stuff as you go, and then just have a finished project at the end. A problem which I encountered for the first time when starting out on my first job was how to get information about the root causes of bugs happening. Since when working on projects on my own during university, I could just use the debugger or I could write any kind of log output I wanted. But this doesn't really work when you have a deployed project on your client server. You can't use the debugger in those cases, and maybe the log output doesn't show you the root cause. So this was something I needed to get used to, because you kind of need to think ahead, kind of determine on whether you should write more log messages just to be sure that you get every information you need later on, and things like this. This is something which you will get better at when your experience grows, but it was something which really was a problem for me when starting out, because I didn't know how to handle it. I couldn't use the debugger, which was kind of my go-to method at the time, because it gave me all the information I needed, but it isn't something you can do with on-site deployments for your customers, because sometimes you don't actually have access to the server and you need to put out requests in order to get the logs. So if you have graduated from university, or you just completed some kind of boot camp and you landed your first job as a software developer or software engineer, you may be asking yourself, how can I prevent any of these problems from happening, or how can I deal with them better? Well, the first thing that you can always do is just ask your colleagues for help. They usually will be quite helpful and help you with solving any kind of problem you're having. They will help you how to navigate through the software and things like that. So asking for help is never a bad idea. A different approach which you will usually learn the most from is having some kind of trial and error approach. You will make mistakes along the way. I have made a lot of mistakes within my career myself, but the key is that you never stop learning from those mistakes, that you improve with those mistakes and that you learn from those mistakes. This is basically the only thing which is the most important, because mistakes will happen. They will just do. Let's be honest. We can't write 100% bug-free code, and you will get some requirement wrong from a customer, just stuff like that. So the best thing to do is just never give up, continue, learn. So this is the second thing which you can do. And as for the third thing which you can do is just continue learning by reading books, by watching tutorials, by taking additional courses and stuff like that, so that you can kind of get a deep dive on certain topics. Maybe you only had Java in university and the first job you just landed happens to use Node.js in the backend. So you kind of should get all the information about Node.js which you can. So you should seek out books which are recommended by colleagues or maybe some friends. You should start watching tutorial videos. Maybe you can even subscribe to a certain Node.js course or things like that. So this is something which you can also do, is to just continue learning, because within the field of software development you should never stop learning. We should always improve. We should always have our eyes open for different topics and for different approaches and learn them and adapt them into our daily work. So that's it for this video on how I started out as a software developer or software engineer, some of the problems I encountered and how I dealt with them. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you have any questions or any suggestions or any criticism, please leave a comment down below and keep on coding.